Welcome everyone to the final session of the colloquium. Now this session is probably a little bit different to some of the other sessions, and my idea here was to introduce a couple of papers that looked at the broader macro landscape rather than specific pension and retirement issues that we've looked at in the rest of the conference. So I would now like to introduce the next presentation in this session. Catherine de Fontenay from the Productivity Commission will be presenting, and it's a pleasure to see Catherine again. We crossed paths several decades ago, both as lecturers in the School of Economics at UNSW. And Catherine will be presenting wealth transfers and their economic effects. And so the floor is yours, Catherine.
Thank you so much. We're really grateful to CEPAR for the chance to present this work, and thank you to all of you who stuck around for the last presentation of the day. This is a report that will appear next week on December 7th. So this is actually something new for the PC. We are presenting the results before the report has been released. So we're very excited to hear what you have to say. On our first slide, what we have is a representation of the cohorts that are in our data set. The data set we're using is HILDA that runs from 2002 to 2018. And what you can see from this slide is two patterns that are very familiar to the people in this room. First, Australians are getting richer. So you can see in each of these cohorts that are organized by their birth year, birth decade, that they will be at least as wealthy as the previous cohort. And the next is that cohorts are maintaining their wealth during the retirement years. So here we've graphed three different cohorts that are in the retirement phase, people born in the 40s and 30s and 20s. And you can see that they're maintaining, as a group, they're maintaining the value of their assets over those retirement years. So that will mean that inheritances are large and getting larger. And that's indeed what we see on the next slide, which is that total inheritances and gifts have been growing over time. So we're talking about wealth transfers, which is inheritances and also gifts given during the lifetime. And they've doubled over the last 20 years. So it's a significant change in real terms. Thanks. So this led to two research questions that we wanted to tackle. The first is, if we do some forward projections, will this growth in wealth transfers continue into the future, and kind of at what rate? So where is that process headed? And in particular, concerns have been raised about the baby boomers and the size of that cohort. And did that mean that, as some have phrased it, a tsunami of wealth was coming down the pipe? The other question is what do these wealth transfers mean for wealth inequality in Australia? What do they mean today? What do current wealth transfers mean for current wealth inequality? But where is that process going to go in the future? And some of you may be aware that some questions have been raised by Thomas Piketty in his famous 2014 book and some others, sort of pointing out that inherited wealth was becoming more and more important in the wealth distribution, and that this could be a contributor to inequality. Now, I should also caveat that this is self-initiated research by the PC, and so it is fact-finding rather than making policy recommendations. Thanks. So Rebecca Chin, who is one of our senior economists and is one of the main authors on the paper, will talk you through her simulation results.
Thanks, Catherine. So on the first question that Catherine mentioned, how do we look into what might happen in the future in regards to wealth transfers? What we did was create a simulation model to do this, which projects income, wealth, and wealth transfers for cohorts of the population up to 2050. So it's similar to the Fiona model, as we have just seen before. This isn't looking at individuals, but cohorts of the population. And a key data source we used was the HILDA survey. We used it to create our initial populations and cohorts and use it to estimate many of our model parameters. One of the key benefits of HILDA is that it's one of the only sources of inheritance data which was important to our project, I guess, which was looking at inheritances and gifts. Of course, like any model, there are limitations. And so just to name a couple here, some population level insights are limited because we don't include births or migration in our projections. And there's also greater uncertainty in the underlying gift data, which is why we mainly focus our results on inheritances. Despite these limitations, we think that the model provides a useful framework for building some forward-looking statistics on the size of inheritances in the future and their likely effects on inequality. So this slide just provides a little bit more detail on the wealth accumulation process in the model. So while actual processes in real life are much more complicated than what we include, we've tried to capture the main elements. So in our model, people in each cohort earn income and can save it into 3 types of wealth: housing, super, and other assets. They earn returns on their wealth and can also draw down on this wealth. People also save some of their wealth transfers that they receive each year. Basically, one of our main findings from the simulation is that intergenerational inheritances are projected to get larger, and we project a 4-fold increase by 2050. This is driven by a few factors, with demographic factors being a key one. For example, the aging population, which Catherine alluded to a bit earlier. So we have a big cohort of baby boomers who are nearing their life expectancy during our projection period. And in our model, this leads to a projected doubling in the number of deaths by 2050. So overall, this means an increase in the number of inheritances. The average value of inheritances received is also projected to increase because people have been having smaller families. So this chart shows that after the baby boom, the fertility rate has been falling in Australia, which means that people who die in the future will have fewer children to leave their wealth to, and all else equal, each child will get a larger amount. The growth in inheritances is also due to increases in the amount of wealth that older people hold. So we project that they'll hold a disproportionately larger share of total wealth in the future, which is a continuation of recent historical trends. From this chart, we see that the share of older people in the population increases by about 12 percentage points over 30 years in our model, but the share of wealth that these people hold increases by quite a bit more than that, about 22 percentage points. And this is partly because of rising housing wealth. We project that housing makes up a larger share of the wealth of older people in the future compared to younger people. This is because older people experience more years of higher housing returns, which is reflected in the high historical returns in their initial wealth values. They draw down on that housing wealth slowly compared to other types of assets, which is consistent with what has been observed in the past. And they inherit large housing wealth from their partners in old age. And now I'll pass it back to Catherine to talk about inequality.
Thank you. So with this very large and growing importance of inheritances, the next question is, well, what is the impact of these wealth transfers on wealth inequality? And so I'm going to begin by talking about what is their current impact, and Rebecca will talk about their simulated impact in the future. So the next slide, thanks. So as you might predict, wealthier people inherit more wealth. So because in a statistical sense, wealthy people are more likely to have wealthy parents, what we see is that the amounts inherited by people in the top wealth quintile, so the top 20%, is much higher than what is inherited by other quintiles. This is a graph of how much is inherited on average over 3 years by the people in these different quintiles. So just bear in mind, this is averaging between people who did receive a bequest and those who did not receive a bequest, and people who did receive a gift and did not receive a gift. So this is an average across all of those people. And so what this says is that people in the top quintile received on average about $12,000 over the course of those 3 years. So it is larger amounts for those larger groups. As you can see, when you average between people who receive and don't receive a bequest, the sums are not enormous. And that has implications for relative. So this is absolute wealth inequality. The fact that wealthy people get more means that it increases absolute wealth inequality. However, when we turn to the next slide, what we can see is that bequests are actually going to reduce relative wealth inequality. And that is very simply because bequests are really only significant, sizable for the bottom quintile. So if we now measure bequests as a share of your existing wealth, what we find is that for people in the top 4 quintiles, the inheritances are a trivial percent of their existing wealth. And remember, that's because we're averaging over people who received a bequest and those who did not receive a bequest. And so the amount we receive over those 3 years is less than 2% of your existing wealth. However, when we look at people in the bottom quintile, what we find is that the amount that they receive over those 3 years averages out to about 30% of their existing wealth. This is for everybody in the quintiles. So those are very significant sums that are accruing to people in the bottom quintile. Now notice that there is a very large confidence interval on that estimate. However, everywhere in that confidence interval, the message is the same. It's a very significant sum for the people in that quintile. So wealth transfers reduce relative wealth inequality. And that is very simply because people that are poorer receive more as a share of their existing wealth. Now we've checked the robustness of that result. So there's a few things about the robustness of that result. This is just based on Hilda, but this result has been found consistently overseas in all of the careful studies that have been done. This is a result that we have checked that is robust to life cycle effects. So we're not getting this result because wealthy people are leaving money to young people who are poor today but are going to be wealthy later. This is not, once we control for life cycle effects, that's not what's driving this result. The other result that we get that is quite interesting and a bit different to overseas is that people don't seem to draw down these inheritances. So unlike overseas where people deplete inheritances, and particularly people at the bottom end of the wealth distribution deplete those inheritances quite quickly, we find that in Australia, they manage to maintain them in nominal terms, and that appears to hold across the wealth distribution. So that's quite an interesting result. Now Rebecca's going to tell us about what that looks like looking forward.
Thanks, Catherine. So as Catherine's just mentioned, the inheritances that were received by richer people were relatively small when compared with their existing wealth based on past data. As we saw in our projections just before too, we expect that inheritances will grow quite large over the next 30 years and will become a much larger share of existing wealth for both lower and higher wealth groups. So for example, by 2048, we project an increase in the size of inheritances from about 15 to 60% of existing wealth for the wealthiest third of recipients aged 60 to 64. Does this mean that the richest people will be much better off in the future? Well, one of the things that we also have to consider is that inheritances tend to be received much later in life. So in the model, there's a peak age group of about 60 to 64 by 2048. And it's a little bit lower based on existing data in Hilda, which is what we see in this chart. So inheritances tend to be received when people are well into middle age, which is generally too late to open up major life choices like buying a house or education. In addition, our model suggests that even though richer people are projected to continue receiving larger wealth transfers, poorer people still get a relatively larger amount when measured as a share of their existing wealth. And this makes the wealth distribution more equal in proportional terms. So you can see from this chart, the improvement in relative wealth equality for Generation X, who are of an age where many are starting to get inheritances in our model. We find similar results for other generations as well. The finding that wealth transfers are equalizing also holds in most of our scenario analysis. How big is this equalizing effect though? Well, we compare it to what our model projects relative wealth equality would look like if the rate of return on housing was 1 percentage point higher or lower. So as shown by the grey shading in this chart, we see that by 2050, the effect from wealth transfers is relatively small compared to the changing housing returns. So even though wealth transfers appear to be equalizing, the effect doesn't seem to be huge. So as I briefly mentioned, we did some scenario analysis. And here we focus on some scenarios where wealth transfers could worsen relative wealth equality in the future. We find that it could happen if, when compared to past outcomes, wealthier people receive much larger inheritances, which is shown by the dark blue line here, or if they save a much larger share of their inheritances compared with less wealthy recipients, as shown by the green line. It's uncertain how likely these scenarios are to occur in the next 30 years, but we can see that under our assumptions, the effects are still projected to be relatively small. It's likely that fluctuations in asset prices will drive larger changes in inequality than wealth transfers will. So as Catherine mentioned, our report is due out next week, so you can find a lot more about our results and analysis in that. But yeah, happy to hear any questions and comments about our presentation today.
Thank you very much for a great presentation from the Productivity Commission. Now, we're now moving to the final presentation of the day. George Kudrna from CEPAR will be presenting his economy-wide effects of mandatory superannuation and its tax concessions.
So thank you, Hazel, for my introduction and for including me in this session. So I think that really my presentation fits, with the presentation that we saw on Fiona and work with Hilda and on transfers. I mean, this is about the model and about its implications for really the accumulation of superannuation. And here we focus on sort of mandatory superannuation, which really drives private pension pillar in Australia. And not just the accumulations, also the decumulation that we heard in the morning. I mean, if you just look at last 20 years and look at the drawdown patterns, the difference between those taking lump sums and drawdowns, that changed completely. So I will talk for about 20 minutes, and then sort of we open up for questions. I should say that I have about 26 slides, quite detailed slides, and I really want those interested to look at these slides. They're going to become available for you and comment on this. So, but I probably won't be able to go through all these 26 slides. There's also a paper that I finished, so with details about the model and its calibration. So let me move to motivation. And I probably sort of wouldn't do this exercise if it weren't the retirement income review. There were almost 300 submissions. I counted 287 submissions, and one of them was from us, from CEPAR. And in terms of these two main issues here, which is the mandatory contribution rate and the taxation, we mainly draw on the results that we did with Alan Woodland, published in 2013. And in that paper, we look at sort of the increases in mandatory contribution rate, we really draw on the model that was developed in my thesis almost a decade ago. So here I really wanted to look at, some of these issues, what results will be in, an up-to-date methodology that is sort of, given the technological advances, much more advanced. So what I do is to quantify, the objectives here are to quantify economy-wide effects of two sets of policy changes. First, to mandatory contribution rate. And here I really focus on the legislated, 12% rate. And then sort of the second policy changes is on superannuation tax concessions. And there I'm interested in sort of hypothetical removal of all concessions. And one of the objectives, is to calculate the cost of, this tax expenditure due to mandatory superannuation in this type of framework. But not only that, here we can, address question that Fiona can. So look at, the implications for government budget, macroeconomic aggregates, but also household welfare and life cycle behavior of households. In order to do this kind of analysis, we developed stochastic overlapping generation model. As I said, it's a macro model that has built-in life cycle behavior of household. And in this framework, the household face stochastic labor productivity. So their earnings, this uncertainty about their earnings. And what that creates is, to add sort of additional motive to save to the model due to precautionary reason. We also have endogenous labor supply and retirement. By endogenous retirement, this is a bit different to international literature. What that means there is sort of age when people retire to claim, social security benefits. Here, what I have in mind is that people can work past the age pension age, for example. And we here introduce the bequest motive and, model to some extent, the transfer of wealth through redistribution of bequests. The model is calibrated to Australia, and in particular in this framework, I want to be really detailed about, the Australian government policy, and in particular about sort of the interaction. I want to capture basically the interactions between mandatory superannuation, means-tested age pension, and progressive income taxation. So just very quickly with the literature, there's quite a large body of international literature dealing with voluntary tax-preferred private pensions. So, in US, they call it retirement accounts using OLG models. And that goes back to, initial paper by Imro Hluglu et al. In 1989, published in American Economic Review, and sort of more recent work there. We have done some work on examining mandatory superannuation using OLG models. And as I said, sort of the most relevant paper here is the one published in Economic Record in 2013. But I also included sort of, the more recent papers upon which I draw when building this model. So, the first one here that we just recently published in European Economic Record looks at means-tested age pension in sort of Australian-based model and also US-based model, and provide some comparison. And I think it's very important also to think about the importance of the age pension, its non-contributory and means-tested features. It does not really impact just those people who get the payments. It also impacts us, high-skilled individuals. The fact that I don't get the pension has impact on my behavior. And just think of yourself, everyone's getting the age pension. That will also cost quite a lot of money that would have to somehow be collected, and people would have to pay taxes. So you would be impacted in that scenario as well during your younger sort of self during the life cycle. And I think that we also contribute to microsimulations models. I mean, what we cannot do is to capture heterogeneity amongst households in terms of their wealth and income, and that's where sort of Mario comes in. But we sort of provide other implications, fiscal, like this economy-wide effects, and there can be closer integrations, basically between sort of model like Maria and Olga modeled in one of the modules. So in terms of the view of the main results, I mean, here it's sort of more addressing sort of these questions in retirement income review. So, you know, we focus mainly on this sort of 12% mandatory contribution rate environment and, you know, how the economy would look. And there, you know, we sort of confirmed the results that we got from this paper in 2030, and the impacts are bigger here because sort of here we calibrating basically the superannuation, mandatory superannuation to in a framework that sort of assume what's called steady states, and that's difficult because, you know, the superannuation is not in a steady state, it's in transition. So we rather than sort of assuming 10% contribution rate, you know, we use average contribution rate since the introduction of the superannuation guarantee, so which is about 7% here, and that sort of quite closely matches the current observed superannuation asset to GDP ratio. So quite large positive implications also for welfare, not only on average, but also across the income distribution. So it's not that sort of only high income would benefit here. In terms of the simulation of that sort of hypothetical removal of superannuation tax concession, we calculate the cost of this tax concession of about 2.5% of GDP. So I think that, you know, I don't know exactly what the number is but I think that we quite close to what's in the review. We find some positive implications, and it's a bit puzzling. I think really these positive implications are due to the mandate. You know, this is the mandatory frameworks. You know, you have to think of that because, you know, voluntary, so people under this case, high income, you know, would not be basically money in. So we find some positive implications, but also negative implications such as reduced output because of increased distortions. Now the tax base basically under this scenario increases. So and in particular that impacts you know, high skill individuals. So there is some sort of, you know, on the basis of that sort of, you know, I wouldn't be removing these concessions, but we can think of some kind of alternatives be further investigated here. Okay, so let me just dive into the model. So it's a stochastic general equilibrium overlapping duration model. It consists of 3 sectors here, and be able to model both what we call small open economy and closed economy kind of simulations. But look, if I were selling this to US, I would just be talking about the partial equilibrium and the general equilibrium effect with endogenous factor prices, wage rate, and the interest rate. And the main focus will be on sort of these general equilibrium impacts. In terms of the household behavior, the structure of the household sector. So here, you know, I assume 16 age groups rather than ages, but the model can be extended, you know, to individual ages. And, you know, if I were looking at things like increasing pension access age, you know, that sort of would be desired. But there are 3 skill types. So you can see, you know, we have some heterogeneity, you know, intragenerational kind of heterogeneity in the model, but, you know, here we can do better. What we do here, the 3 skill types are basically everything in terms of the household behavior is sort of calibrated to Hilda. Okay, so we have those who not completed high school, those who so they the low skill, then we have high skill, those with bachelor degree and above, and middle skills everywhere in the middle. As I said, it's a stochastic model, so we here estimate the stochastic labor productivities by the skill types. Labor supply is stochastic, so individuals make labor leisure decisions. And here, you know, the retirement is endogenous, so we allow household to work past the pension access age. So the optimization problem here, you know, captures sort of the consumption saving, labor supply, and retirement decisions, and, you know, people also derive utility from upon leaving bequest. Okay, so now a bit of details about the about sort of the model and the optimization problem. I'm not going to go into the details, but so what happens in the model? The economic agents, you know, they maximize lifetime expected utility that they derive from consumption and leisure. And when they die, they also derive utility from bequest. I also want to point to discounting here, discounting due to the standard discount factor, but also discounting due to the survival probabilities. And here we capture, what's called mortality gradient by this social economic status, by the skill type. So we model here, lifespan expectancy gaps between high and low skill. Okay, so I mean, we hear today in the presentations in the morning, sort of how important is that people face different life expectancies. Here the gap is about 5 years, so it's the measures can be much higher than that. That's what we put into the model, and that's maximized subject to the budget constraints. So on this side you have savings, and that's equal to the incomes from the asset income, from the interest income, labor earnings, contributions. And I'd like to say that in this model, contributions are made by, mandatory contributions are made by households. But I can assure you, in this kind of neoclassical model, it does not matter who pays the mandatory contributions, whether it's the household or whether it's on the producer side. The results are basically exactly the same. So this is very important, just to addressing, this recent Australian literature that look at the, economic incidence of superannuation. In this model, it's households, okay? That's very important. Now, these are the bequest transfers, so the inheritances. We also have social transfers paid to individuals prior to the pension access age. And these are estimated using Hilda also for the different skill types. Then you have the age pension payments from the eligibility age, superannuation payout. These are the drawdowns. And this is the sort of income tax base that they pay, the income tax and the consumption expenditure. And as I said, the labor earnings are stochastic due to the shock to labor productivity, wage rate per hour. And, I like to be a bit more specific here about how we sort of model superannuation. So there's this mandatory contribution rate. This is the superannuation asset accumulation. So that's, prior to the superannuation access age, call it JR here. So individuals, they pay the contribution. So this is the mandatory contributions, and know that, we put some kind of cap there as well, the contribution cap into the model. And they also pay the tax here. Contribution sort of introduce some progressivity to the contribution. So as I said, I'm trying to be as detailed as possible. This is the fund earnings tax rate. It's effective 7%. And what we do in terms of the drawdown, so we assume some pre-specified drawdown fraction, after that sort of superannuation outage. And look, we can do definitely better here. I mean, that sort of drawdown fraction is quite different to the minimum drawdown strategy, for example. And this is the age pension. So we include, the income test here. The difference, compared to other work that I did, is we calibrate the income test in order to match the distribution of the age eligible population for the pension on the basis of their age pension payments. So we're matching quite closely, the proportion of self-funded retirees and those on full pension and those on half pension. And we do that by sort of calibrating the take rate and calibrating the income disregard here. So you may think of this framework as sort of combining both the income and the asset test into one test. And, we have lots of details here in terms of the assessable income. I know that this is not the rule, so we assume that 50% of labor earnings are included. I mean, the rule is a bit different. I think that sort of here we do quite a good job. The other important bit here when studying the superannuation tax concession is the taxable income. So this is basically the taxable income in the benchmark. So this labor earnings minus the mandatory contribution, asset income, plus the age pension. And look, we can even put in SATO, the senior Australian tax offset and this kind of thing. It's sort of wouldn't be much different. I mean, if you look at sort of at older age, the economic agents hardly pay any tax, many of them, in the model. Okay, and these are sort of this is under counterfactual of removal of superannuation tax. So here, we remove this deduction and we include the interest on the superannuation asset, and here it's treated exactly the same. It's sort of deemed income. Right, so that's the rest of the model, and I go to the model solutions and performance here. So this column is the data, and this is the model match basically, and you can see we do quite a good job in terms of superannuation asset. As I said, the mandatory contribution rate in the benchmark model is 7%. And that's sort of the fiscal side. So you can see sort of the model has quite detailed the budget compositions here. That's the mandatory contribution rate. Or maybe I would spend a little bit of time here on the distribution of the these pensioners. So you can see we have about 23% post-funded retirees, 42% on full pension, and 34% on part pensions, and doing quite well in terms of matching this data. I should say sort of that this self-funded proportion of self-funded retirees, it's more of a guess. I mean, I use the population data. If you use the population data, you get about 30%, but just don't forget that some of these people actually do not qualify for the age pension because of the minimum residency requirements. So I think that's sort of 25% sort of better target here. And also, you can get the life cycle variables from this model here. It's relative to Y bar, which is economy-wide earnings, but think of $64,000. So if you want dollars here, you can get dollars. I mean, I should say that in academic literature, we use percentages and this kind of things. You can derive here for every variable dollars, billions, trillions. So that's no problem there. Okay, so let me very quickly go to the simulation results first for the mandatory contribution rate. So that's sort of quite straightforward, and I will focus on the last column here, which shows basically these general equilibrium impacts of that new environment where you have 12% rate rather than 7% rate. So here you can see very positive impact for many macroeconomic. GDP goes up by 6.2, household wealth 12%, welfare going up across the income distribution. And that's really despite a lower wage rate. So here you can see wage rate goes down. So it's sort of not surprising here. Consumption up 4.7%. So positive implications here. Very different situation when you look at when you would get rid of actually superannuation. So here sort of you can see the wage rate goes up by 7.3%. Look at we would be on average or by 22%. So not good outcome here. And so these are the fiscal implications, and they're reported in as a percentage of GDP. I would maybe just focus again on this sort of distribution of those age 65 and over. And so if you can see the pension expenditure declines, and the pension expenditure declines largely because the proportion of self-funded retirees goes up, and that's because those on full age pension goes down. And so I'll leave it here. Move to the life cycle consumption. So you can look at, for example, the implications for the household variables, and sort of here, you can see that under that yellow line goes up over almost entire life cycle. I should say this is related to Y bar in the benchmark. The benchmark Y bar also increases under the yellow, so that sort of should shift down a little bit. But I think that's where this needs to be related. In terms of, the effect of changing tax concessions, so this is what I found. So here the last column is sort of removing all concessions. So that's sort of the hypothetical scenario. And you can see a decline in the effective labor supply and the output. And that's really driven by sort of this increase in the tax base, which creates more distortions to labor supply because of people facing higher marginal tax rate, particularly those with high skill, high incomes. But you can see the superannuation asset increases quite significantly. That's because these concessional taxes on the accumulation, they now removed. And that seems to help or offsets more the decline the ordinary liquid private assets and leading to increased household wealth. And in terms of welfare, what's happening here is that we allow, so this model has budget constraint, and the budget constraint, government budget constraint, is balanced through changes in the consumption tax rate. And that's basically what you can see here is that, because of the increase in the total tax revenue, the consumption tax can go down. It can go down quite dramatically. So this is the percentage decline. So think of consumption tax rate goes down from just over 10%, to just over 6%, and that's sort of what helps, the low skill in terms of welfare. The way how I calculate the tax concessions is a bit difficult here because, it's not only each of these item changes, also the GDP. And here, sort of, I use the GDP, the sort of new, which is higher in sort of new economy. And the way how you get the tax concession is to deduct this number, for the total tax revenue, including the spread from the benchmark level here. That's about 5%. So, and so this is basically work in progress. So we want to look at sensitivity analysis of these results, particularly to changes in the drawdown assumptions. So the drawdown fraction here, just to tell you, is for the age group 65 to 69 is about 25% on balance, and then it's going up gradually, to reach some drawdown one. Close to the final age in the model. So we may look at sort of like lump sum and minimum drawdown. There are other stuff as well. The stuff that I did was sort of look at the higher 12% CG rate environment for the hypothetical removal of superannuation tax concessions. That's basically where we're heading. And if you run basically the same hypothetical removal, of course, the high skill individuals would be even more unhappy, with removing of these concessions. So I think that's all from me on this. And if you have any questions, that's my email, and the paper and presentations will be available at this sort of link.
Thank you very much, George. Yeah, I think that's it's a really good paper to finish the conference because it's bringing all of the things we talked about into a macro model. So thank you very much, George.